Real quick overview of where we're going over a three-part series. Today, we're going to talk about an overview of Web3 system design. And then the primary issue we're going to cover from a legal perspective today is the securities laws. And so I know you guys are talking about this from a business and technological perspective. How we view decentralization and Web3 design is different from a legal perspective, and it all kind of interplays. So that'll be today. Then we're going to do white papers, communication strategies, and practical tips. And then the third session, we're getting into some structuring, financing, and tax planning. So today is the most academic in nature, and we're going to get more practical and specific as we work through the three sessions. Just 30 seconds on me and my colleague, Ben. This is all that we do. I was a traditionally trained corporate lawyer for the first decade or so of my career, then became a Bitcoiner. And when you become a Bitcoiner as a lawyer, this is what happens. So helping people build and design complex Web3 systems, from DeFi to gaming systems to representing centralized exchanges like Coinbase and all the other ones. So this is all that Ben and I do at this point. And there's Ben's handsome face. All right, so this is what we're going to cover today. Overview of Web3 systems and a securities framework. All right, so what is the concept of decentralized open systems from a legal perspective, okay? The key difference is this concept of decentralization. And really, when I say that as a lawyer in this frame, what I'm saying is the company is on the path to not having a core centralized company, but really a decentralized ecosystem. Now, we might have a centralized company in the overall system design. Oftentimes it's a labs company, a Solana Labs as an example, or a DevCo, but it is a different overall model. And so starting from the very beginning, we have to build the foundation of the house that we're building, knowing that that's the track that we are going to be on. And so how will things be different? Okay, so one is going to be governance, right? So in a traditional Web2 corporation, there's one entity. Maybe you're dropping centralized controlled subsidiaries for local compliance issues, but really you're starting with a Delaware C Corp, and you're issuing shares to a founding group and then ultimately to investors and employees through option grants. And that's as complex as it gets, right? And so governance is stockholders, board, officers. With a Web3 system design, we're going to get as complex as having a centralized company to a full-on DAO. And it can be a DAO, sort of a loaded term. Ask a bunch of people, you're going to get a bunch of different answers. But governance is going to vary significantly. Are token holders controlling that entity? What does that entity do in the ecosystem? So there's like this control and governance layer just in the function of the world. What does it do? And we want to have things where we're avoiding like the Uki DAO situation where you're a totally naked group of individuals. We're going to touch on those types of structures at various points. But from a governance perspective, it's going to be very different because we're going to have this open architecture and this open system with engagement at some level with token holders that are going to be involved in the governance system. So that's one big difference. Another one is the IP is going to be very different. So every model is different, from a heavy application layer, centralized gaming system that's bringing in an NFT wizard sword or utility token, to a pure play protocol like a layer 2 with no GUI layer, right? So what are some core fundamentals that run across every Web3 business that we build? Well, there's typically a protocol layer. So some sort of smart contract protocol, layer 2 scaling solution, whatever it is, but some smart contract or layer 1 protocol. And then most companies that I work with, but certainly not all of them, have some sort of application layer that stacks on top of that public infrastructure. And so how we think about IP, are we doing an MIT license? Are we doing a BSL? How do we think about other people spinning up a different L2? It's one of the things you're seeing in the space right now if you follow it closely. So IP is very, very important and very different than a traditional Web2 company where Delaware C Corp owns all of the IP and is going to exploit that and monetize that through traditional channels. So how we think about pulling apart the model can be very different from an intellectual property perspective. And on top of that, the monetization strategy is typically very different. So traditional Web2 business, I'm Microsoft, I'm building proprietary software, I'm going to license it. Monetization can be very simple, right? When we're in a world where the protocol is a public infrastructure, a public good, what is our business model? Is there an application layer that is revenue generating that's on top of that? Or is there going to be some sort of alignment of interest because we're going to build out tooling and use cases for the protocol and the native digital asset, and there's going to be on-chain fees or some other revenue mechanism that's going to increase the price over time, right? And so all different ways you can build your business model from a monetization strategy perspective, and all things that we have to think about in the very beginning when I'm working with an entrepreneur at the outset. What is your business going to look like? Web 2 versus Web 3, which we think through all of these different monetization strategies. All right, some of the different organizational structures that we use. So, all right, we touched on a traditional C Corp, right? So Delaware C Corp, centralized company, management board, stockholders. Web 3, even if we're going to go with a pure open source protocol, no application layer business, in the overwhelming majority of times, if not literally all of them, we still start with a centralized initial development company. For US founders, because of controlled foreign corporation tax rules that we're not going to get into today, I put that aside, we start with the Delaware C Corp. For non-US founders, we oftentimes start with a Cayman or a BVI, a tax haven jurisdiction. So there's almost always some sort of centralized development company that we start with in these models. Foundation companies and DAOs, right? So choice of jurisdiction for the foundation company, we see Caymans and Swiss the most. We use special purpose vehicles in different jurisdictions for different reasons. But in terms of your DAO foundation wrapper, typically Cayman and Swiss are the two most common these days. There's other things, those like the UNA, unincorporated partnerships. There's Delaware nonprofit non-stocks. And then there's things like the Wyoming DAO that functions a lot like a limited liability company. And so those are sort of some of the different structures that we use. And then post-launch, there's always this question of, what do we do with a centralized entity in that system? Can we dissolve it and walk away and further our decentralization narrative? Or do we need to have like a labs or a startup studio model that fits within the ecosystem? Or is it just a straight application layer company? We built a protocol and now we're making money on our website and our UI. I want to pause there and see, Ben, is there anything that you wanted to add on that set there before we get into some of the different issues?
I would say generally when it comes to DAO structuring, I mean, Andy's been in this for a decade now. I've been in this for several years. The law is still so new and new jurisdictions are popping up. And so just because Swiss is what we used 3 years ago doesn't mean that Swiss is the recommended jurisdiction today. And we're starting to really see, in the same way that Delaware became the corporate law of choice because there was a race to the bottom, we're starting to see some new jurisdictions pop up for the same reasons.
And feel free to interrupt me with questions. So just feel free to go off mute and just ask me to stop, and I'm happy to pause and answer questions as well. So what are some of the different issues? And again, we're talking about different issues from Web 2 to Web 3, right? So the first one is, what is the thing, right? And in my old life as a traditionally trained corporate lawyer, representing technology companies, we didn't have to start with the base DNA of anything, right? There are forms, there are precedents. We know what Series A preferred stock is. We know what debt is. And in this world, we have to break it down into its DNA. So we start with, what is the thing, right? Is it a security? Is it a commodity? Is it a currency, right? And so one of the things that gets really interesting and challenging is the blend of product and security, right? So in my old world, from a securities law perspective, I could always tell people, you can always talk about factual business information, whether we're in a Reg D world, whether we're in a Reg S world, you could always communicate product and factual business information. That was a safe world. And now the thing that might be the security is also the product. And so this blend of complex issues that only exist in Web 3 come up in a bunch of different lights. And that's one of them. Sort of, what is the thing that we're dealing with at the very beginning? Next one are taxes. right? Again, a traditional Web 2 company, if you're in the US, you make money, you pay taxes, right? There are very complex and hard issues with tax compliance in the US. There's the obvious things like the broker dealer rules that our tax team is writing comments to Uncle Sam on right now, but sneaky things that are really high stakes and really complicated. How do we get our initial token allocations just to our own development company, to our own founders, to our investors? How do we do that in a way that preserves the early price action and doesn't result in a big tax bill within a liquid asset delivered at mainnet launch? So very novel and unique tax issues that would never come up in Web 2, that come up every single day in Web 3. Another one are the Bank Secrecy Act, FinCEN, and virtual asset service provider laws. Anytime that we are touching tokens or digital assets of any kind, are we a money transmitter? Are we processing value from one person to another? And then same thing with the custodial laws. Are we holding assets or value for somebody else? Again, in Web 2, not things that we had to deal with. Intellectual property we touched on. What is open source? What's proprietary? Pulling apart that onion, pulling apart that technology stack and saying, this is the line that's proprietary and we're going to monetize it or not. Here's the part that's open source. What are the terms of the open source license? What can people deal with it? So then we're asking this question of what bodies of law even apply? And then to add to the degree of difficulty, there's this question of what countries' laws apply. In a Web 2 business, in the overwhelming majority of time, you're working with US laws and you know what bodies of law apply. Are we talking about Bank Secrecy Act, which is the United States? Or are we talking about the vast laws of the Cayman Islands because that's where our DAO is? Did we have a sequencer in a third country? What instantiation is the AWS location running on, right? Is that the jurisdiction for vast laws? And so there's these really complex questions in bodies of law to deal with. And then the last one here is, and it's regulatory uncertain. So even if you have a thesis around, this is the asset, this is the thing, and we believe that these are the bodies of law that apply for these countries, now you're applying those to a gray area. And so very difficult, and you have to make very risk-based business decisions where legal is one input into an ultimate business decision. Ben, anything you want to jump in there? I'm going to flip us to our next slide.
No, I think that covers it.
So why does this matter, right? And so this I'm obviously very passionate about what I do. This matters to me a lot. So I want to, and I believe that our industry is focusing on democratizing the internet. Well, how does this work? It turns software-based systems and other technologies into public infrastructure as opposed to proprietary networks, right? You can look at Apple or Facebook, or there's countless examples of a corporate network, right? And in a corporate network, they take a massive take rate. So if you're a developer creating a ton of value and you're in the Apple ecosystem, you're going to lose 30% off the bat. Similar economics with Roblox, right? If you're a developer in a centralized system with a corporate network, you are going to pay through the nose to Apple, right? In an open network, it is open and permissionless, and you can have value accrue to the content creators, to the entrepreneurs in that open internet. That democratizes the internet. The other thing too that it does is it creates an open experience, right? So if you go onto the App Store of Apple, it's curated. You're seeing what Apple, some other person, some other company, what they've decided they want you to see. It's not open, it's not free. A lot of crypto is pushed out of Apple, right? And so this creates an open experience that, in my judgment, going to the next one, creates a much better competitive situation. So in an open ecosystem, anybody can build on top of it. It lowers the barriers to entry. We get greater diversity in terms of ideas, creating a marketplace for ideas, different applications, different use cases. And I believe that that creates better consumer choice. I don't want Apple to tell me what apps I need on my phone or on my iPad or my other device. I would like to be able to see everything. I'd like a competition to bring the best value to the user. And so I think there's this quality aspect that can come through in an open and competitive system. The other thing too are freedoms, right? And there's a lot of this debate going on now, and I'm not going to get into politics, obviously, but no matter what side you come out on any potential issue, freedom of speech, not having some corporate network that can censor your group or their group or spin the narrative. And so having open internet in a competitive system creates greater liberties. I don't believe that we need a corporate overlord. The other thing too here is what it does. It enables you to reward stakeholders in the network. In a Web 2 system, all of the value accrues to Apple stockholders, right? In a Web 3 system, you can reward early adopters, you can reward content creators, you can enable builders to get rewarded for the scope of the network expanding and for their contributions, or even just ordinary consumers. So there's a lot of great things that come from Web3, and I believe this is the future of all of the systems that we're going to be building going forward.
Quick question on that part, though, because doesn't that lend itself then to like, because I believe in that obviously very heavily, but then you start getting into like, is it a dividend and like rev sharing models? Like so what are your thoughts on how, on like, are there, on the limitations and constraints from doing the thing that is actually like most inherent to the decentralized network, which is rewarding people for participating?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And as we get into, and there'll be other parts where we can get into that in detail, but I'll give you maybe a shorter answer now. A lot of the things that I believe that are interesting in Web3 are higher risk, right? So a good old fashioned buy and burn, making investments out of a DAO where you're going to have return for people, staking rewards that are not just the security protocol, but just basically rewarding people with yield. All of those things are higher risk that still get built into systems. And so one that's going on now, right, is Uni. You can see where they're talking about how you're going to vote that in or what that's going to do. Those of you that follow the space really closely, Blur has a proposal up now to turn on their fee switch. So yeah, it is definitely higher risk to reward stakeholders through core economics. Absolutely.
And the challenge is, though, is also that there really isn't any clear direction, right? We don't know if it's like, it seems like it's all just gray area because we're trying to force feed all of the decisions and things that we want to do into laws that really aren't applied to this. They were created for other purposes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so it is that framework that I started with is, what is the thing? What are the laws that apply? What countries' laws apply? And then how are we going to interpret it, right? And how are we going to navigate in this gray area? And then feeding that into a risk-based business decision. And that's really the key. That is the artwork. And so I have different business leaders to make different decisions across the board. They could all be centralized exchanges, and Coinbase is going to make a different decision than Binance, for example, even with very similar fact sets, right? And so that's part of the opportunity, that's a part of the artwork, and it's very, very challenging, obviously. And we're going to actually get into the Howey test here. And so it's a great one to mention because we're applying a test that is from the 30s, right? About orange groves to digital assets. So let's go to that as a good sort of segue to that. Ben, do you want to touch on the overview of the securities laws and all this stuff here?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the threshold question really is the underlying token itself or the offer and sale of that token, however you're doing that, whatever the transaction or scheme is that a security? Because if that is a security, then it triggers a whole host of laws that otherwise would not apply. Some of those laws are included on this slide. So it's the Securities Act of 1933, Exchange Act of 1934, Investment Company Act, Investment Advisor Act, Blue Sky laws. And at the end of the day, when it comes to the securities laws, our position and the way that we typically advise our clients is you need to comply with securities laws. And so if the token or if that scheme is a security, then you've got to comply, and that adds all sorts of layers of complexity. On top of the securities laws, there are a whole host of other laws that may also be triggered by the token offering or just by the token existing. CFTC, commodities, financial, I'm blanking on this one, the Commodities Futures Trade Commission, sorry about that. OFAC and sanctions compliance with the Department of the Treasury. FinCEN as well with the Department of Treasury, all sorts of state money transmitter regulations. So FinCEN and OFAC, that's on the federal level, but there's like a state-by-state analysis that you need to do. There's FTC laws as well that we're not going to be getting into today, as well as sale of goods related laws. So the next section, we're really focused on the securities laws here, but again, this is just one of various legal regimes that may be applicable. Here, what we have excerpted is the definition of security under the 1933 Act. And you'll see that we have underlined investment contract. That is the hook that the SEC has used to date for applying securities laws to Web3 and token offerings. And so, as I mentioned, anything in that list is a security. The hook has been investment contract. So what is an investment contract? Under the Howey test, it has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to be an investment of money in a common enterprise with an expectation of profits solely from the managerial or entrepreneurial efforts of others. Subsequent court decisions have read out that solely from, and it's really primarily from the efforts of third parties. As Andy previewed, this case arose in the context of orange groves. So tracts of land were sold for purposes of growing oranges. The purchasers who bought that land were not expected to be growing and monetizing the orange groves themselves. They were relying on the efforts of a third party, like cultivation and property management company. So it was that whole scheme read together. The Supreme Court ultimately decided that scheme was a security, and therefore the securities laws applied.
Let's grab Adam's question real quick.
Yeah, I had a question with regards to the first prong, investment of money. I've heard some conflicting guidance on that, on whether it actually is just money or whether that can extend to work, right, in some form or fashion. So can you expand on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we're actually going to be covering that on, you previewed this on the next page.
Okay, sorry.
Traditionally, it has been broader. Traditionally, it's been broader than just an investment of money. So it can include services, contribution of other goods, etc. There's some uncertainty that has arisen for those of you who have followed the Ripple case, right? Where in the context of an airdrop or in the context of token grants to employees, service providers of the company, the court in Ripple ultimately determined that that did not constitute investment of money because there was no investment of money itself. Couple things to note there. One, that's a very narrow interpretation. And two, it's not actually binding, right? Because it hasn't gone through the proper channels. It hasn't been appealed yet. So under US common law, the way that we interpret the law and apply it, that is persuasive, but it's not authoritative. So other courts don't necessarily need to follow that same reason.
I do have another question. Oh, sorry, lower my hand. Which is, so one of the really frustrating things for me about this space is the ambiguity, and also the selective nature of prosecution, which is to say that, you know, like I watched the library case really closely, and I felt like they did a lot of things really, really right, and they still got totally whammied for basically having a fundraising token, even though it was functional pretty much from the word go. So, I mean, how much does that influence the overall process from your perspective? I appreciate that this is a business decision at the end of the day, but I mean, like, is an ideal type of system in your world one that utilizes somewhat risky, you know, attributes to make the system itself as good as it can be, but just don't be in the top 10% of like the most egregious, or how do you think about risk balancing given the environment of selective prosecution?
It's a really
sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
It's a really good question. And the outcome is a culmination of a lot of micro decisions, from are we going to have an upgradable smart contract protocol or non-upgradable, right? All the way to what is our communication strategy going to be? Yeah, so that's one principle I want to lay out there. The other one is I don't have any problem with risk, right? Risk is fine. Risk needs to be married up with an appropriate and right-sized business opportunity. So the thing that I go nuts on is when people are exposing themselves to risk, either unknowingly or they are doing disproportionate risk to the business opportunity. All right. So what I do all day is help people think through those micro decisions as they're going through and building their model, whatever it is, to make the decision that is right for them, to make that risk-based decision on a strategy all the way from like the technology all the way to a tweet to get to the right outcome for them. And then what we do is we do look at it from a totality, and you want to be in the top 0.0001% of the best. You want to be in the herd. You don't want to be an outlier on any of these different decisions, but we let the dog wag the tail. We make the decisions from a principle-based perspective all the way through the process, and then zoom out and go where we stand within market and with other enforcement actions, and what are we seeing in the space, and then does this align with your hopes, dreams, and visions for your business? And that's the process by which we get to the right answer for the particular business and technological team.
I have a quick
Thank you.
question here.
Yeah.
Is there any precedent around whether it's a difference of whether you mint all the tokens at once or whether you deploy a smart contract that mines it at certain periods of time according to distribution, right? Meaning, pre-minting the whole batch and selling versus, mining it, as far as how they view one versus the other, or it doesn't matter.
No, it matters a lot. Yeah. So one of the things that we do every single time is we work up what's called a plan of distribution. What is the means by which, and what is the economics of getting the token out of the system? And so mining is the least risky of any system, right? If you think about Bitcoin, for example, how Satoshi and Ryan Strauss were sitting there mining Bitcoin in the very beginning, and that was a very easy way to distribute it in the least risk, right? A contrary example would be, they use the term pre-mine, but allocating it all to a centralized development company and then doling it out for like capital raising or handing it out for other purposes would be the most risky. We don't do either of those. I mean, there's still some mining distributions I do that are on that fair launch kind of spectrum, but that's atypical these days. But from a legal perspective, a plug in your miner fair launch would be absolutely the least risky way to do it. The overwhelming majority of the time, it's in the middle there between those two things. All right, unless there's any questions, I'm going to keep moving us along, Ben. I think we spent some time on investment of money, so touch on common enterprise real quickly. We'll go to the next one.
Courts typically just assume that this prong is satisfied, right? So horizontal common enterprise means that contributions are pulled together, profits and risks are distributed on a pro rata basis. Given that all tokens are fungible, again, like courts will just read this in. They will assume that this exists. Really quickly, vertical, there are a couple of different flavors, but if the core dev team keeps some of the tokens on its balance sheet or otherwise has exposure to the tokens and the token holders do as well, then that typically satisfies the vertical category of common enterprise. So the next piece, we're kind of breaking up the expectation of profits from the efforts of others into two separate prongs. The courts have typically looked at these. A lot of times they look at them together. It is going to be somewhat challenging to defeat the argument that the token itself is not being purchased for investment purposes, although it's not impossible. And the SEC, FinHub came out with like all sorts of potential tests or factors for looking at when a token may be truly more of a utility token rather than a security or investment token. It's pretty hard for a lot of projects that exist to truly stick within those confines. I mean, one possibility is that you really limit transferability of the tokens and restrict the tokens so that it can only be used for consumptive purposes within whatever protocol it is that you're building out, or an application layer on top of that. But typically that's not the direction that our clients choose to go. And so it comes down to the next part of this test, which is the efforts of others. And here's really where we focus a lot of our energy when it comes to advising our clients. At a high level, we have a shorthand test for this, which is the Bahamas test. And so if the founding team retired to the Bahamas, was drinking Mai Tais all day, would the protocol continue to function, or would everything fall apart? And if everything falls apart without the core team continuing to provide services and development and marketing and everything they are doing at the onset for the protocol, and for whatever the Web3 product is, you fail the Bahamas test. And there's a very strong argument that there's too much centralization within the structure, and that gives serious rise to securities risk. Obviously, we understand that you're not going to be fully decentralized on day one. That's where this concept of progressive decentralization comes into play, which is an allusion to the Hinman speech, where he talked about the fact that, yes, at the time of launch, Ethereum, the ETH token, was likely a security, but given the state of where Ethereum, the network is today, well, at the time that he gave the speech, it kind of through that progressive decentralization, what was once a security is no longer. And that's one of the areas in which we advise our clients to think about their roadmap to really getting to this progressive decentralization, so that even at the time of launch, the token itself, or that offering of the token, would be deemed a security, that 6 months, 9 months, 12 months down the line, that's no longer the case.
So what are some of the types of decentralization that we work with, and just some of the terminology that we use? One is technical decentralization. And so this is a trustless and autonomous platform. So let's use ETH, for example. If the tokens were sufficiently distributed, it would not be able to be attacked, right? It would be an open and autonomous platform, and ETH is evenly distributed throughout the world. And it is a neutral protocol that people could use, right? That's great. That works from a technological perspective. With a smart contract protocol, if it's immutable, right? We typically say that it is technologically decentralized at time zero, since no one can change it, right? So a upgradable protocol is going to be a different part of that analysis and higher risk, right? From a decentralization perspective. So it really depends on what you're building. Another one is economic decentralization. So is there a decentralized economy that is built around a specific protocol or platform, right? So are the applications unique businesses that are built on top of or around this decentralized protocol or platform, right? And ETH is a great example. There's the Ethereum protocol that a lot of people build on top of, and there's this whole economy that goes around there, right? And so Vitalik could go to the Bahamas, and I'm still going to get my wonderful crypto kitties, right? Like it still works. And then, the way that we think about legal decentralization is really technological and or economic decentralization that results in the inapplicability of a specific legal regime. All right, so let me unpack that a little bit. That's a mouthful. So laws were enacted for a specific reason, right? And if the model is decentralized in a way so that the underlying reason for the law no longer exists, then it's decentralized and the laws should not apply when you're thinking about it from an intellectual and rigorous perspective. We've been talking about the securities laws. Let's keep with this one, but you can apply this logical reasoning to, a wide array of laws. The primary underpinning of the securities laws is asymmetry of information, right? The founders, the promoters of a centralized business, they have all the information, and there are required disclosures that companies have to make, right? So public companies are the best example of this, right? Amazon has to put out its 10K, its 10Q, its proxies, its 8Ks. People with inside information are not allowed to buy and sell, right? If it truly is decentralized, then there is no asymmetry of information. So Amazon is that one example. Think about the gold market, right? Who is the entity, the person that has all the information on gold such that you would have to have a disclosure from them for the market to work, right? Is it Peter Schiff? Like, who is it? It doesn't make any sense, right? It's a decentralized ecosystem. It's not to say that like with oil, you don't have the, OPEC and other cartels that have some influence, but that's sort of the core principle from a first principles perspective. We are decentralized in a way to where legal regimes are no longer applicable, and we focus on technology, we focus on economics. So what are some of the tools that we use to achieve these objectives? Well, one is intellectual property, right? So if it's open and permissionless technology, that's different than if it's a proprietary corporate stack, if it's a proprietary network, right? If it's permissionless blockchains and smart contracts, these are tools that enable technological decentralization. Also, there's a lot of on-chain transparency. You can see all the movement of ETH, Bitcoin, and other transactions on chain. That reduces the risk of asymmetrical information. Also, when it's credibly neutral and composable, it supports economic decentralization. Other people can build on this economic infrastructure, so it facilitates further decentralization. Native tokens, right? That's something that we use for decentralization. You can have an open economy where there's an alignment of interest. So you can award, early adopters, content creators, builders, ordinary customers. You can make grants to third parties to build businesses in the ecosystem, which is critical for economic decentralization. You've probably seen all these foundations with their grants and, AIPs, if it's the Ape Foundation, where people are getting grants and awards to build things in the ecosystem. All of that furthers economic decentralization. And then voting and governance, right? So native tokens are used in voting and governance, right? And so that supports technological decentralization. If the native tokens and the foundations in conjunction are used to govern the technology in a way where it's a common good and a common infrastructure, that supports decentralization. When the technology is credibly neutral, so no foundation or no corporation controls the foundation and the token holders get to vote, that makes it more neutral and much more decentralized. It minimizes the efforts of others. You've got a foundation with a representative board of community members that can, guide and steward the efforts of the community in a way to where it's not a centralized development company. You're not worried on, Bill Gates's entrepreneurial efforts at Microsoft over the years. It's a community that's operating through a non-commercial entity. It minimizes the efforts of others. And also, since there's no individual at the top, it minimizes the asymmetry of information through DAO and transparency reports and all the things that we had to there. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Quick question. This is a little more specific, actually, but like, let's say you have an Inc. and a DAO. So you have an Inc. and a foundation that work hand in hand, because obviously there are reasons for both. Can a DAO acquire the Inc. or acquire the assets of an Inc. at some point? Like, let's say the DAO starts thriving and the Inc. is not as sustainable long-term, but the DAO is building a sustainable economy. What happens if the DAO tries to acquire the Inc.?
Anything is possible. It would depend on the business model of the Inc. and what it's doing. And here's a really important point. What we cannot do is take centralized entrepreneurial efforts and shoehorn them into a foundation or other non-commercial entity and then just get them in the same the same economic outcome, the same economic reality.
So you're saying you can't acquire an Inc. can't acquire a DAO is what we're saying, basically. But a DAO can a DAO acquire an Inc.?
It could go either way.
Okay.
Right. But the answer is not binary. It's not could it, it's should it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the principle on an M&A deal of a DAO buying an Inc. would be, did we just take centralized entrepreneurial efforts and build them into a different entity? Right now, instead of it being a Delaware company that's building the metaverse, building the game, or whatever it is, it's going to integrate the token, and we're dependent on that company to do it. Did we just shoehorn it over into a non-commercial entity? That wouldn't solve any problems. It would create a whole host of tax issues and other things. Mm-hmm. So my answer isn't you couldn't do it. Of course, I could come up with models where it makes sense to do that. But I think in the overwhelming majority of instances, it would not make sense from a legal perspective to centralize that part. We spend so much time and energy pulling apart the systems to having one part that is open and decentralized and neutral, all this infrastructure controlled by the community, and then having a development company or a labs company that is an influential member of the community, but still just a member of a community. To re-centralize that would fly against all of the work that I do building these open Web3 systems. So it's not impossible, and it would depend on what people are actually building and what the business model is and why we wanted to do the M&A deal. But it is in all likelihood not going to be a great idea. You could do it, but it would be that you probably shouldn't.
Okay.
I have a quick question. So what if we're a product company that wants to use a token for as more like a loyalty point and a gamification tool than a purely decentralized system? And what if we as a product company want to eventually allow governance, but are not ready to do so at the launch of the token? How do we balance those priorities, and how do we balance what it sounds like you're saying is like everything is a trade-off, right? And those trade-offs put you on a different side of the spectrum. How do we think to balance like those competing priorities?
Yeah, good question. Let me unpack it a little bit. We got to get into some of the legal regimes we haven't covered in this one. So what you're talking about is a centralized token in the sense that we're not positioning it that we are decentralizing the efforts of others. There is a centralized company that's got a loyalty rewards point in it, and its value will rise and fall with the value of that loyalty point by the centralized company, right? And so if you think about that Howey framework that we went through, you are all in on the other prongs. You are not going to be able to win on decentralizing the efforts of others, because that's where most people focus. So one example would be people are acquiring it not for profit. You have to say, look, no, it is centralized. You're dependent on us, but people are acquiring it to consume, not because they want to have a profit motive in it. And the next slide, the next topic is going to be directly on point for this, or at least very, very close. But I want to pause there, Vince, to see if I got your question. But I'm going to talk the next one about consumer tokens.
Perfect. Consumption is the key. Let's jump into it.
Yeah. So this is one where consumer token design strategies. All right. And this is one where I am a bit of an outlier, I think, is an expert in the space and is a practitioner. The overwhelming majority of people will shrug their shoulders and say utility tokens, consumables, they're dead to the world. I don't believe in that. That's not a viable path. All right. That's wrong. All right. So we experimented with these things as an industry in the early years. And the reason why they failed was because those early projects and those early designs were infrastructure that were intended to be decentralized. There weren't a lot of good consumer use cases and consumer applications in the early years of blockchain development and Web3 design, right? So if you want to build a consumer token, what are the things that we need to do? So we are basically, Vince, your question was, we're conceding that it's centralized, right, in this model, okay? And so what we need to do is the token itself cannot have any intrinsic qualities of a security. So this is where, we had some questions about buy and burn and staking or dividend-like characteristics. In this model, none of those things are on the table, right? It needs to have inherent intrinsic characteristics of a consumable product, and that's it. We're not going to be able to have any staking, buy and burn, anything of that nature, right? So there's got to be some working, fully functioning good and service at that time that people can consume the token in, right? So from a technological perspective, from a design perspective, it could be a totally centralized system, but the token is designed to be consumed, and people can consume it at time zero, the exact moment that they got it. And that's how it's structured. From a plan of distribution perspective, right? At various times we talked about mining versus a pre-mine. On this one, our plan of distribution is it's never been sold for capital raising purposes. The people that can get access to it are actual users, right? And let's go to the loyalty point example. Andy's actually a user of the platform. I have a username and a password. I have a history. Now I can acquire it. How much could I acquire? An amount that I could reasonably consume within a reasonable time period. So what we carved out here was Andy bought $10 million worth of this token. Obviously, I'm going to try to flip it. I'm not buying Alaska Airline points or acquiring Alaska Airline points or a loyalty point for $10 million because I can't fly that much. So in the plan of distribution, amounts that are reasonable for a reasonable user or a super user, but there is an upward bound of what people could use based on their actual consumption, right? In these models, I want to build in some proof of consumption, right? So maybe in the first 30, 60, 90 days, it's not tradable, it's not resellable, and the person must prove that they've consumed it in the game or the metaverse or the system before they can resell. So that's a requirement of the plan of distribution. And then what we need to do is have avoid speculative structures. In the old years, we would do things like token bonuses, discounts, other things that would give people sort of a juice on their purchase. We need fair and transparent distributions to users, right? And then in the last bucket here is what is our communication strategy? And this is the best legal yield for the money, right? So I frequently have to have people change their business plans, change their goals, do different business outcomes. And so there's a high cost to the strategy. Communications, it's very easy to get good yield. Don't be an idiot, right? So in this one, we absolutely need to have very strict what we call message discipline. How are we communicating the token? How are we communicating the product? It needs to be very carefully constructed. So this should be common sense, but I see it all the time. And so marketing needs to be fair and accurate about this being a product. We're absolutely going to avoid any communications that this looks like a financial instrument or an investment if there's any opportunity for profit. And we're even going to have any restrictions on, communicating any listing or secondary sales or any of those kind of things. So that's kind of the 3-minute overview of a consumer design strategy. And Vince, that would fit into your model of a centralized company with some sort of affinity program or loyalty point in the system, right? These are the techniques that we would use to achieve those goals.
Andy, can I add one more caveat in there for you?
Please.
So what if in the event that that product company happens to be a SaaS, it has distribution partners, so companies that resell their product, and you want to gate different tiers of access of B2B products behind how many tokens they get, possibly offering commission bonuses and incentives around that. Is there any issue with either them buying the token directly, them being allocated that token, and or how they purchase it that makes a difference? And if it is staked to require access to it, just think of it as a gated token SaaS type thing. So I mean, any issues around that?
So I like those types of models, right? So that's an actual use case. Thou shalt have the NFT, thou shalt have this many fungible tokens to access the SaaS offering. That's a good way to de-risk it. If I was building that with you, one of the things I would talk about is, okay, who are these partners, right? They're probably accredited or outside of the United States, right?
No, they're B2B companies that resell our products.
I would assume they're not accredited in the definition. Like they would not be able to.
You mean like they're incorporated locally? Yeah, we have executed contracts. Yeah. They're
So-
not DAOs or decentralized protocols, our clients.
So let me sort of go where I'm going with it.
Yeah.
So if on that, so one thing Ben talked about was we do our best to comply with securities laws. We can likely get them their initial allocation while just complying with the securities laws. Like, so on that first from, let's say that it's a pretty centralized model, from Delaware company to partner, let's just comply with securities laws, right? If they're accredited, if they're non-US, is it just not a public offering? Is it a services type model? Like, let's figure it out. Let's just get them that token and comply. And then you build into that broader use case. Here is the usage of the token. You're acquiring this not to flip on Binance, but because you want to have a SaaS offering.
Correct.
And Adam, I think I saw your hand go up there.
I don't think we have enough time. We're going to do individual sessions. I got lots of questions.
Okay. Great. Ben, is there anything you wanted to jump in here on in the last 3 minutes? I wanted to sort of power us through that last topic.
No, I mean, as I guess as Andy's answers are showing, like it's certainly not a one size fits all model. We have the first principles that we go back to when thinking about system design, but it very much depends on the facts and circumstances of the specific protocol, business, use case for the token that you guys are building out. So I mean,
have things changed?
Sorry,
Have things changed since the Ripple case? Since the Ripple announcement, like, has there been any like shift in your strategy? And like, I know even in our own work, when we were working on our own token, we were right. It was like we were releasing it right after that Ripple case, and like it kind of validated some of our thoughts and some of our approaches. But like, I wonder if that's changed anything for you guys in terms of just strategy in general. Or
yes
like,
and no.
Or nuances.
Yeah. Yes and no. It makes me, because we're trying to toggle on these spectrums, right? And so something like an airdrop to me feels a lot less risky after Ripple, right? People aren't paying money for it. And that's one that I feel better about, because there's no legal solution to that. You're either doing the airdrop or you're not. There isn't a securities exemption that I can pull out for that. Now, even the big L1s are still compensating employees, service providers under our 701 token plans. Under Ripple, we could because Ripple's it's not precedent, but the answer is, if you can comply with securities laws, you just do it, right? Like, there's no reason not to. So the yes part of your answer is things like an airdrop or other broad-based distributions where we couldn't comply with securities laws and meet the business objectives. People have moved a little bit up that risk continuum, but on things that I just consider blocking and tackling, we're still using a token plan and complying with 701, which is a securities exemption we use for stock options and other service-based compensation. Because why not, right? There's no reason not to do it. And so it's a yes and no answer.
All right, and I have one other more broad question, and we run over a minute or two. What have you guys seen so far, or what has inspired you recently, or over the last, let's say, 6 months or so? Have you seen any successful token designs or new innovations or nuances around tokenomics in general that have like inspired you, or you were like, wow, that's really interesting, or just kind of thinking about like because you guys see way more of this than any of us do. Are there any like new because I'd say a lot of the concepts really kind of stemmed even from the ApeCoin. I feel like ApeCoin was one of the pioneers in the consumer world of tokens. Obviously there's Uniswap and others, but I'm curious if you've seen anything that's been like more like, wow, that's impressive. Maybe we're heading in the right direction, because it feels like we hit a wall with a bunch of the original ones.
Well, I mean, so I'm recorded here. So I work with Arbitrum. I really like the Arbitrum protocol and how that was designed, and I'm a homer, and so I really like that design and how that all came out. Same answer with Blur, right? Having a community-driven NFT protocol and application, and there's some interesting governance proposals up now, another one of ours. And so I think that we're continuing to push the envelope in terms of interesting designs and having core economics built into the token economics in ways that are interesting. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's going to be.
Are there specific like nuanced mechanisms that you found to be more like of those or others that you found, like, besides even which company does it? I'm actually more curious about like, are there specific unique mechanisms or actions that the tokens are able to provide, or I'm just kind of curious if there's things that are new that I haven't been aware of. Always
probably nothing that's new.
Yeah,
No,
there's
I
not,
mean, I don't think it's,
part of the challenge is there's not much shared knowledge in the industry. It's a
Right.
lot of siloed information. So, I'm always trying to, of people that are seeing a lot of this stuff, I think there's a huge opportunity. That's why we're even doing this, is like bringing groups together and publicly sharing information about what we're learning together. So, if there are other nuances, I'm always interested to see if anything innovative has come out of recently.
I'd add this, right? And one of the things that we do, or at least we, do the best of our ability is, on a no names basis, of course, part of my job is to help you understand what's keeping your peers up at night. What are the things that I'm seeing in different models that might be good use cases or designs or strategies that we're seeing? Because while you guys are going to look at one business and maybe have some other people that you're talking to, right? I've been involved in hundreds of launches, right? I mean, I got over 300 at one point, right? So I'm looking at different white papers from DeFi to L1s to L2s to gaming system designs, and they're all different, but a lot of the core principles are the same. And so being sort of a thought partner and helping and just serving up a menu of things to consider and then outlining them for you, whether it's how are we just running the sequencer in the layer 2, right? Like what piece of the technology is moving out? What are the governance things that I love from early models? And what are the things that going back in time with 2020 hindsight, I'd do a different decision, right? Because it's not efficient, or on the other side, it's too centralized. Like what are the grant programs that have gone well and people have loved? What are the ones that are just too costly, right? And so like part of what we try to do is just be really helpful thought partners, because in our seat, we're just fortunate I get a wide look at everything that's going on in the industry. So yeah. And it's very model specific though, but that's what I do when I'm reading white papers, obviously, or whatever our, deck in this role, it's not always white papers. But when I'm reading those things and digesting them, there's obviously the legal issues, but then there's also just the, hey, from a technological or business perspective, industry perspective, how are you thinking about X, Y, and Z? And that's a part of the art.
Really want to thank you guys for coming, and I hope it was useful. This is only session 1 of 3. So until next time.